Mel Gibson spent decades as one of the most bankable names in film, an Oscar-winning director, an action hero, a man whose face alone could sell out a theater. He had built that reputation the hard way, clawing up from broke theater work to global stardom, then reinventing himself again as a filmmaker capable of turning deeply personal, unconventional projects into box office juggernauts. Few actors of his generation managed that kind of second act, but on one summer night in 2006, all of that nearly came undone in the back of a patrol car on a dark stretch of California highway. In the space of a single traffic stop, decades of goodwill and industry standing were put at risk by a handful of sentences. What he said that night would follow him for the rest of his career, resurfacing again and again whenever a new controversy or a new interview brought his name back into the headlines. This is the story of how it happened, the long climb that came before it, the fallout that came after, and the complicated, still unfolding life of a man who has spent almost 20 years trying to define himself as something other than that single night. Mel Gerard Gibson was born on January 3, 1956, in Peekskill, New York, the sixth of 11 children. His father, Hutton, and mother, and ran a household that was loud, crowded, and steeped in Irish Catholic tradition. Mel's own unusual middle names were drawn from Irish saints, a tribute to his mother's hometown of Longford. When Mel was 12, his father made a decision that would reroute the entire family's future. He relocated everyone to New South Wales, Australia. Multiple reasons have been reported for the move over the years, including a desire to put distance between his eldest son and the U.S. military draft during the Vietnam War era. Whatever the full mix of motivations, the move placed young Mel in a new country, a new school system, and eventually, a new industry that would define his life. Life in Australia was, by most accounts, a jarring adjustment. He arrived a preteen American in a family of 11 children, thrust into an unfamiliar culture with a thick accent that made him stand out at school. He has spoken in later years about feeling like an outsider during those first years, an experience that some biographers have pointed to as an early source of the restless, combative energy that would later show up both in his best film performances and in his worst public moments. Educated by Christian brothers at a Catholic college in Sydney, Gibson later trained at the National Institute of Dramatic Art, one of the most competitive drama schools in the country, sharing a stage in student productions with future star Judy Davis. Classmates and instructors reportedly noticed his intensity early, a willingness to commit fully to a role that occasionally tipped into recklessness on stage. He graduated in the late 1970s and moved quickly from bit parts into what would become one of the most unlikely breakout roles in film history. His first credited film role paid him only a few $100s. Then came Mad Max, a scrappy, low-budget Australian action film that turned Gibson into the face of a franchise and, eventually, into an international star. Critics took notice almost immediately, with some comparing his screen presence to old Hollywood leading men. Gibson leaned into that momentum but refused to be boxed in. He reportedly passed on the chance to play James Bond and instead alternated between gritty action films, war dramas, and romantic comedies. Even after landing his defining role, Gibson didn't immediately abandon the stage. For a stretch of the early 1980s, he kept working in Australian theater, taking modest television guest spots to pay rent while living in a cramped shared apartment with his future wife, Robin Moore. That grounding in low-budget, high-effort work is something people who knew him at the time have pointed to as part of why he never seemed entirely comfortable with the trappings of Hollywood fame once it arrived. He had spent years scraping by, and the sudden wealth and attention reportedly took some getting used to. By the late 1980s, Lethal Weapon had cemented him as one of the biggest action stars on the planet, and the following decade brought a string of commercial hits alongside prestige work, from war epics to family-friendly voice work in animated films. He moved behind the camera as well, founding his own production company, so he could exert more creative control over his projects, and eventually winning the Academy Award for Best Director for Braveheart in 1995, a film he also starred in and helped finance. By the turn of the millennium, he was commanding some of the largest paychecks in the industry and was frequently mentioned in the same breath as classic Hollywood leading men of an earlier generation. Then, in 2004, He took the biggest creative gamble of his career. The Passion of the Christ was filmed largely in Aramaic and Latin, funded independently after mainstream studios balked at the subject matter and Gibson's approach to it. That independence meant Gibson personally shouldered much of the financial risk, and by most estimates it paid off spectacularly. The film became one of the highest-grossing R-rated films in American box office history, and one of the most argued-about films of its era. Religious leaders and film critics debated its historical accuracy, its extreme violence, and its portrayal of the Jewish characters in the gospel narrative. Scholars pointed out numerous scenes and details that departed from historical record or scripture altogether, dramatic embellishments that made for compelling cinema but drew sharp criticism from historians and theologians alike. Some religious organizations warned publicly that the film risked reviving old, dangerous stereotypes about Jewish people and the crucifixion. Gibson defended the film as a personal expression of his faith, but the criticism would resurface with new intensity just 2 years later, after Gibson's own remarks during his arrest made headlines and gave his earlier critics fresh ammunition. The film's star, Jim Caviezel, has said publicly that taking the role of Jesus effectively ended his run as a mainstream Hollywood leading man, even though the film made his director enormously wealthy. Before the role, Caviezel had been building momentum with high-profile parts in films like The Count of Monte Cristo. According to Caviezel, Gibson tried to talk him out of accepting the part before shooting began, warning him it could cost him his career and telling him, in essence, that he might never work in the industry again. Caviezel took the role anyway, citing his personal faith, and has said he holds no resentment toward Gibson over how things played out, describing his former director, years later, as someone in need of prayer rather than judgment. By the summer of 2006, Gibson had built a reputation as one of Hollywood's most successful actor-directors. That reputation collided head-on with reality in the early hours of July 28, 2006, when a Los Angeles County Sheriff's deputy named James clocked Gibson's car speeding along the Pacific Coast Highway in Malibu. Gibson was pulled over for driving well over the posted limit, and a breathalyzer test reportedly put his blood alcohol level at 0.12%, well above California's legal limit of 0.08. According to the arrest report that later became public, Gibson did not go quietly. He is alleged to have launched into a profanity-laced tirade against the deputy, cursing at him, threatening him, and making statements blaming Jewish people for wars around the world, remarks made all the more explosive by the fact that the arresting officer was himself Jewish. Gibson was handcuffed, booked, held for several hours, and released the same morning on bail. For a short time, the full details of what Gibson had said stayed out of public view. Reports later emerged alleging that the initial arrest report had been altered before release, with references to the anti-Semitic comments removed, and that the unedited version only became public after being leaked to a celebrity news outlet. The deputy who wrote the original report said in later legal proceedings that he faced retaliation at work for including those comments in the first place, an allegation that became the subject of its own long-running lawsuit against the county, separate from anything involving Gibson directly. Within days of the story breaking, it had exploded across the entertainment press. Studio executives, Jewish advocacy organizations, and fellow celebrities weighed in publicly, many condemning the remarks in the strongest terms, and some openly questioning whether they could continue working with him. Gibson issued a written apology almost immediately, calling his own behavior despicable, and asking to meet personally with leaders in the Jewish community to make amends. He also took the unusual step of checking himself into an alcohol treatment program within days of the arrest, before any court had ordered him to do so. Months later, that August, he pleaded no contest to a misdemeanor charge of driving with an elevated blood alcohol level and was sentenced to 3 years of probation along with mandatory alcohol rehabilitation. That October, Gibson agreed to sit down with Diane Sawyer for his first extended television interview since the arrest. He didn't try to explain away what he'd said. He called the remarks the ramblings of someone deep in addiction and admitted that the backlash from Hollywood, while painful, was something he understood. His words, he said, had scared people, and he couldn't blame them for reacting the way they did. Sawyer pressed him on specifics, how it felt to watch powerful people in the industry publicly call for studios to stop hiring him, and whether he believed his career could ever fully recover. Gibson's answers were notably free of self-pity. He said he had never really depended on the industry's goodwill in the first place, and that he understood everything he had built could disappear the next day. What mattered to him, he said, was proving through his actions over time that the man in that arrest report wasn't who he actually was. He also used the interview to speak candidly about addiction itself, describing sobriety as a daily fight rather than something a person simply decides and finishes. He talked about having stayed sober for years earlier in his life, before a relapse pulled him back under just months before the Malibu arrest, describing how quickly the pull of alcohol could return even after a long period of control, comparing it to a switch that could flip the moment someone put a drink in front of him. At the time of the interview, roughly 2 months removed from the arrest, he said he hadn't had a drink since that night and had come to view alcohol itself as something closer to poison than a vice. It was, by most accounts, one of the more unguarded interviews of his career, an attempt to explain, not excuse, what had happened. The professional consequences were real and lasting, even if they took a few years to fully materialize. Gibson's talent agency dropped him after another controversy. A leaked recording of a heated argument with then-girlfriend Oksana Grigorieva reignited public anger and brought fresh scrutiny to his past comments in 2010. He was pushed off high-profile projects, including reportedly being removed from a cameo appearance in a major studio comedy sequel after members of the production objected to his involvement. Roles that once would have gone automatically to a bankable leading man started going to other actors instead, and for a stretch Gibson found himself playing supporting parts and villains in lower-budget action films rather than headlining them. Old stories resurfaced too. Actress Winona Ryder gave interviews years apart recounting an alleged encounter from the 1990s in which she said Gibson made offensive remarks about her friend's sexuality and, upon learning she was Jewish, made a deeply offensive comment referencing the Holocaust. She said that when she tried to describe the incident to people in Hollywood at the time, almost no one believed her. Gibson's representatives denied the account both times it resurfaced in the press, calling it false and claiming Gibson had tried unsuccessfully to confront her about it directly. Ryder, for her part, said she stood by her account and hoped Gibson had found genuine ways to address his issues, while making clear she wasn't interested in being part of that process herself. Gibson didn't disappear from the industry, though. He rebuilt slowly, largely through directing rather than acting, choosing projects that let his work speak for itself away from the spotlight of a leading role. His 2016 war film Hacksaw Ridge was a critical success and earned multiple Academy Award nominations, marking one of the clear signs that at least some doors in Hollywood had reopened for him. He also grew his production company into a broader distribution operation, took select acting roles in genre films, and moved into producing work, including the surprise 2023 box office hit Sound of Freedom and the 2026 thriller Flight Risk, which he also directed. Even as his career stabilized, the 2006 arrest kept resurfacing in interviews, sometimes at Gibson's own visible frustration. During a 2010 press junket, a reporter's questions about the incident prompted a noticeably irritated response on camera. In a 2016 podcast interview promoting Hacksaw Ridge, he pushed back on the idea that a single recorded outburst years earlier should define how people judged him, arguing that his actions in the years since told a more accurate story than that one night did. Gibson's personal life has generated nearly as many headlines as his career, and it has followed a pattern of its own: long, stable relationships that eventually ended in very public, very messy fashion. He was married to his first wife, Robin Moore, for close to 3 decades before their divorce was finalized, and the two share 7 children together, ranging widely in age. It was, by outward appearances, the most conventional and longest-lasting relationship of his adult life. His relationship with Russian pianist and songwriter Oksana Grigorieva, which began not long after that divorce, produced a daughter but ended in a bitter and highly public legal battle that included a restraining order, domestic violence allegations, and the leaked audio recordings that reignited his public image problems in 2010. Gibson has acknowledged slapping Grigorieva once during an argument, saying he believed she was endangering their infant daughter at the time by holding her while acting erratically, while denying more serious allegations she made against him, including claims that he had caused more severe physical injuries. The dispute dragged on for years across custody hearings and financial settlements, with Grigorieva ultimately forfeiting a significant portion of an agreed settlement after she gave a media interview that her legal team argued violated a confidentiality agreement. He later began a long relationship with equestrian and screenwriter Rosalind Ross, with whom he has a young son, and the two were together for roughly a decade, a period that largely coincided with his professional rebuilding before the couple reportedly separated. Now in his 70s, Gibson remains a fixture of entertainment coverage, as much for the arc of his personal relationships and the controversies that have trailed him as for the films that made him famous in the first place. Reports have periodically surfaced regarding his interest in future relationships and in continuing to grow his already large family, keeping tabloid attention on his private life even during stretches when his professional work has stayed relatively quiet. 2 decades on, that night on Pacific Coast Highway is still the single moment most people associate with his name, proof of how quickly a few minutes can reshape the way the world sees someone who spent a lifetime building a very different reputation. It's a strange kind of legacy for a man with an Academy Award, a string of era-defining box office hits, and one of the most unlikely rags-to-riches stories in modern Hollywood, that a handful of sentences, spoken in anger on the side of a highway at 2 in the morning, could end up carrying as much weight in the public memory as everything that came before or after them. What makes the story linger, more than most celebrity scandals, is that Gibson never really tried to make it disappear. He didn't scrub it from interviews or refuse to discuss it. Instead, over nearly 20 years, he kept being asked about it, kept answering, and kept working, sometimes gracefully, sometimes visibly annoyed, but rarely evasive. Whether that consistency amounts to genuine accountability or simply the passage of time wearing down public anger is something people still disagree about, and probably always will. What's your favorite Mel Gibson film, before or after 2006? Let us know in the comments below, and don't forget to like and subscribe for more deep dives into the stories behind Hollywood's biggest names.